So on behalf of UNESCO Social and Human Sciences sector and on behalf of our Futures Literacy team leader, Ms. Kristen Piper, we would like to welcome you to the second session of the HLCP Foresight Network Futures Masterclass pilot. We would like to thank you for supporting this joint initiative aiming at futures and foresight capacity building, peer learning and knowledge transfer. Last Friday, we had the chance to celebrate at UNESCO World Futures Day, and we had the chance for the first time to collectively reflect on the importance of futures, on what we see and do in the present. UNESCO's coordinator of the HLCP Foresight Network initiated this futures capacity building activity and joined forces with UN Global Pulse, UNEP, ILO, UNPPPA, UN Habitat, and external experts from the academia and the private sector to design and prototype this series of futures masterclasses. It is hoped that the skills and knowledge learned throughout this process can make contributions to the HLCP strategic orientation in support of the 2030 agenda and our common agenda. This is a piloting activity, and our objective is to scale it up and make it available to the wider system in the future. So we're very grateful for your interest and support. In the previous session, we took a deep dive on horizon scanning. In today's session, we will be exploring the fascinating world of scenarios. With your permission, we would like to record the theory part of the session to make it available to the colleagues that are not able to join us today. We would like to take one more minute to warmly thank our good colleague from ILO, Alim Khan, for the excellent collaboration we had and his continued support of the HLCP Foresight Network activities. Alim will be introducing our invited experts for today's session, and without a further delay, I'm going to pass it to Alim. Alim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ariana. That's a very nice introduction, and thank you for the excellent collaboration on this module as well from UNESCO. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Schultz. You'll see in a moment when we turn to the Miro board that there is a bio of Wendy describing her experience and projects. I will just add a little bit to that by saying that Wendy has accompanied the ILO on its foresight journey beginning several years ago now, starting in the field with a very intense 3-day workshop organized in collaboration with our International Training Center in Turin and our technical team in Cairo. That kicked off actually some intense foresight work in the ILO. Since then, Wendy's also accompanied us on assignments dealing with the presidency of the G20 and agenda setting, the scenarios for the post-COVID-19 futures that we might touch on this afternoon, and other projects as well. So she's helped us put together a comprehensive ILO foresight guide, which we also are going to be expanding beyond our internal use in the coming year. So Wendy's experience goes back almost 40 years now. She is one of the leading futures expert, and I can think of no one better suited to do a deep dive on scenarios with us than Wendy. She specializes also in participatory approaches, and her workshops are very engaging, creative, and demonstrate a lot of best practice when it comes to hybrid design and the use of online tools such as Miro, as you'll see this afternoon. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Wendy to kick off. Thank you.
Alim, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And everyone, welcome to this exploration of the uses of scenarios. I'm absolutely delighted to see this much interest and certainly hope that you find the next 2 to 2.5 hours useful and that you can take away from it a new skill. So what I am going to actually be doing is using the Miro board not only as our workspace for this workshop, but also as my presentation space. So one of the first questions that I have to everyone who's online, and if you can just use your reactions button to kind of raise your hand. How many of you have used the Miro board before in a workshop setting to brainstorm and to add ideas? Yes, no? Raise your hand if yes. Thumbs up. Okay, so this is going to be interesting. Well, the good news is it's fairly simple to use the Miro board. And the first place we need to start is by telling you that this is going to require you to be, as I would say with colleagues, a bit digitally ambidextrous. So I will be showing you the Miro board in the Zoom meeting room. So I'll be sharing my browser screen with you so you can see what I see. But when we ask you to add ideas in, you'll need to open your own browser and open Miro in your own browser so that you will at times have Zoom open and see what I see. And you'll also need to be looking in your browser. So let me first share the Miro board with you and give you a brief introduction to what we're going to be doing in the next 2 hours, and also to the Miro board itself. We will be working off and on in breakout groups, and we'll certainly hope that everyone will start each breakout group by introducing yourselves to the other people in your group so that we all start to get to know each other a bit. Okay, this is a Miro board, for those of you who haven't seen one before. It's basically a big digital whiteboard. So if you imagine yourself to actually be sitting in a room with me and with everyone else, we would have flip charts and we would have stickies and Post-its, and we would have magic markers. So since we cannot all be in a room together, this serves the same purpose. And right now you're thinking, oh my word, that's busy, and oh, ah. So the great thing about Miro is that you can zoom in, right? And if you open your browser and follow a link, it should take you right initially to this corner. So here we are. This is the Futures Masterclass on scenarios, our deep dive into scenarios, and what we're going to be doing in the next 20 minutes or so is obviously welcome you all into the room. And with this group, actually, I think we have a total of about 19 participants. What I think we might want to do before we go into breakout is practice a little bit. So, and get each other introduced at the same time. So we've got about 20 minutes, a little more, since I had originally scheduled this for 2 hours. And I think, Iriana, this is actually a 2.5-hour session, isn't it? Yeah, good. Extra time, all the better. So we're going to take a little extra time for welcomes, and then we're going to immediately leap into the future. One of the interesting things about working with scenarios is that it is a form of exploring how potential changes and their impacts might evolve and create emergent new and novel properties in our futures. And they also allow us explicitly to acknowledge that there isn't just one future. There are multiple possible futures. And because we already live in uncertain times, and the range of uncertainties only expand the further forward we try to think into the future, scenarios of alternative possible futures really let us explore potentials, explore the possibilities that might surprise us, and give us a space in which we can think about how to adapt before we are surprised by future change. So because of that, a well-written scenario may contain some elements of forecasting, of quantitative forecasting, say of demographics, or of economic trends, or of environmental characteristics, but it inevitably must involve a measure of creativity. So there are no right or wrong answers when it comes to creating scenarios. There are more and less useful answers given what the question is or the research issue that you're framing your explorations around. But inevitably, thinking about the future requires creativity. So what we are going to do now is an exercise called the thing from the future. The activities that are core to futures research. First, we have to notice that change is happening around us, that things are going to be different, and that those changes are popping up in every single sector. They aren't limited to just technology or just values or just politics or just the environment. Change erupts everywhere. We have to start noticing that. Once we notice that, then the second sort of key activity in futures thinking is to start asking the question, so what? All right, so a change is happening. What will be the impact? Who will feel those impacts? Who will be empowered by them? Who will be marginalized by them? How will those impacts, how will those changes reverberate through our systems of daily life, through our systems of the economy, of politics, of our social networks, right? So what are the implications of change and who feels them? So the more you start to, one, heighten your awareness of change, and two, get used to thinking through what the impacts of change are and what the cascades of impact that will be generated by change are, essentially you are already stepping into imagining the future, imagining different possible futures. So that's number 3, exploring alternative futures. Now, this is scenario building. So it is one of the key aspects in future studies is the thought experiment of exploring impacts of change and what different outcomes they might create, what different futures we might face. This is not about visioning. This is not about articulating a desired future world or a desired future. That is an entirely separate exercise that is based on clarifying people's values and helping them articulate what those values might mean in creating a world that is different from the present, that is preferable to the present. That's visioning. That's, as a colleague says, that's futures for the heart, futures that tell us where we want to go. Scenario building, scenarios are futures for the head. They are thought experiments. They are meant to be a form of contingency planning because we face unknown outcomes, unknown environments in the future. So we want to enhance our ability to respond with flexibility, with resilience to different possible futures. So exploring alternative futures, that's exactly what scenario building is all about. After we do that, then we can start asking the question, what future do we want? If that's the entire range of futures we might face, what are the futures that we would define and want to create if we were to start building? And then, of course, the last of these 5 key activities is creating change based on an understanding of the future environments we might face and based on a clarification of the futures that we want. And again, I would have to say that at every point in this, the more voices, the more perspectives, the greater the diversity, the greater the inclusion that you can bring to bear on every single one of those 5 steps, no matter what methods you choose, the better off you will be. More diversity means you will recognize a greater variety of change happening in a greater variety of places. More diversity means you will be more critical and more thoughtful about understanding where change affects different groups of people, different parts of our environment. More diversity means a richer set of stories about possible futures. And if we're going to be defining what kinds of futures are desirable, we absolutely have to ask everyone, right? We don't want to be colonizing other people's futures. And in order to create change, we all need to work together. So diversity, inclusiveness, absolutely key to all of this. All right. What are images of alternative futures? Again, they are thought experiments. They're explorations of what kind of futures we might face. Do we make them up entirely out of our imaginations? No, in rigorous futures thinking, we use the results of our horizon scanning databases. Now, the previous masterclass was all about horizon scanning, and you practiced tracking down trends, emerging signals of change, seeds of change, clustering them, understanding how they interconnect, right? So part of maintaining observations and evidence about change in the world is so that you can use that observable change, right? Footnote, change that you can footnote, change that you can cite where you found the observation. You can use that as your starting point for all the rest of your futures thinking. So you start with an understanding of some of the big trends of change, some of the new, novel, potentially disruptive, emerging changes and seeds of change. And you then take those and, using any one of a number of methods, explore what their outcomes might be to a specific time horizon. So usually when we're thinking about scenarios, when we're engaging in this thought experiment, we're doing so for a reason. Maybe policy making, maybe you're a business person and you have a new product or service you're interested in designing and launching. And so for a business person, maybe your time horizon is the next 1 to 2 to 5 years. For a policymaker, maybe you're thinking of installing an entirely new transportation system or putting in a dam someplace. And you're talking about building infrastructure that may be around for 50 to 100 to 200 years. So your time horizon might be different. We think about specifying the time horizons, thinking about what the trends and changes might be relevant to the issue we're concerned about or the decision we have to make. And again, we apply a variety of different methods to those changes to explore forward to that time horizon, always with the assumption that there isn't a single future. We can't predict, we are forecasting. So the other thing to bear in mind is that all of our cultures already have embedded in them thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of images of the future. Because artists, there are images of the future in almost every religious ideology, religious faith. There are images of the future embedded in every single political ideology. There are images of the future everywhere around us. What we are trying to do in creating strategic scenarios, strategic images of the future, is be able to formally say, this is the method we use, this is the data about change that this image of the future was built upon, and therefore we can track change and see whether it's heading to one or another of our scenarios. So scenarios as they are built in future studies, in foresight, in anticipation, are meant to be practical in helping us make decisions and make plans for the future. And part of that, interestingly enough, is to create images of the future, at least a few of which are very, very different from the present. because we already know what we need to do about the present. I mean, we don't always do it, but we understand what the conditions of the present are. Scenarios are about contingency planning, so being prepared for unexpected things. So you need to think about how to create unexpected sounding futures. What's the weirdest future you can imagine? Again, that's part of the reason for exercises like Thing from the Future, because they help you get very specific about the details of the future, and in that way you can create some challenging expressions of how strange change might be as these artifacts, right? A map of insects that might have alternative medicine capabilities. And always remember, again, thought experiments, scenarios are futures for the head. Visions, on the other hand, are futures for the heart. Don't confuse the two. Every scenario that you write, every well-written scenario should have upsides and downsides. It should not be all positive. It should not be all negative, because the real world isn't all positive or all negative. The real world has moments of awe and delight and moments of terror and horror. Scenarios are meant to be explorations of what might be possible in the future. Visions are statements of what we want, and they're based on values, and they can be weighted more towards the desirable than not. So keep the two separate. We're about thought experiments. That's what this particular masterclass is about. So the other thing is that they are absolutely not predictions. And in fact, scenarios are, in one way, the methodological answer to the fact that as futures researchers, we can't predict. Why not? Well, the previous class, the previous session talked a great deal about VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and oh wow, I never quite get the acronym right, having said that. All right, somebody tell me what VUCA is. Volatile,
Ambiguous.
uncertain,
Ambiguous.
complex and ambiguous. Thank you. I always want to go adaptive after complex for somehow. So the point being, we live in turbulent times. We, especially in the last 3 years, live in extraordinarily turbulent times. And I have a whole set of colleagues who would love to talk to you about post-normal times and post-normal theory. But even in normal times, prediction is not possible. We can forecast and we can explore. What's the difference? All right, this graph I keep around because this is actually consumer price index inflation projection put out by the UK government at one point in time, 2006 maybe, no, 2010, based on constant nominal interest rates. That's not what is important. What's important is that the graph traces the actual data points they had from observation up until about mid-2009. And then after that, as many econometricians do, they wanted to forecast. Even with the best data, even with the most rigorous thinking and formulation of your algorithms, when you are engaging in quantitative forecasting, the further you go into the future, the wider the bands of uncertainty are around your forecast. That's what that kind of pink fog represents, widening bands of uncertainty around the forecast. So one way that we can address those widening bands of uncertainty is to say, instead of using quantitative forecasting, we're going to do what people do best and make sense of the situation by telling stories. So scenarios are us telling stories about possible outcomes in the future that are different from the present and that are based on the information about change we have right now, both trends of change that we've been tracking and emerging changes that we have just identified using horizon scanning. So we take that data and we use it to make stories. Now, here's the thing. There are at least 24 different ways to build scenarios, all of which are useful in different settings, in different situations. So no one tool is useful for every building project, right? So one of the things that you want to ask yourself is, what are we actually trying to do in building our scenarios, both in terms of the experience people will have in the process and what we want to do, what kind of outcome we want, what kind of scenarios we want. Do we want experiential design scenarios? Do we want short narratives that can be used as a way to test policies? Do we want to think through how multiple different environmental variables might play out in the future? In that case, multiple different variables, you might want something more like a futures table or morphological analysis. If you're interested in stories that capture some key dimensions of uncertainty, then deductive scenarios like the 2x2s we'll be using today. If you're interested in the stories people are telling about the future and metaphors people are using to express their feelings about the future, then maybe you want to do a more narrative-based approach like causal layered analysis or scenario archetypes. If you're really interested in systemic interconnections, then maybe you want to use something like Manoa scenario building, which is based on futures wheels, or take a systems dynamics approach. So a lot of different approaches to building scenarios. We are going to focus in on axes of uncertainty. It was created by Jay Ogilvy. It was popularized by Peter Schultz in The Art of the Long View, and it has been widely used everywhere, literally all around the world, by decision makers in business, policy making, and civil society. It is possibly the most widely used form of scenario building on the planet. Part of the reason for that is that it is designed for strategic insight and it's focused on a decision-making goal or challenge. Of course, it appeals to decision makers. The very first question in this approach to scenario building is, you're the decision maker, what's keeping you awake at night? What is the decision that you're most worried about, maybe in terms of a policy or a new product or service, or a philanthropic campaign you're about to start? So of course, it focuses on the decision maker. Of course, they're going to like it. It is designed around the idea of managing critical uncertainties, and that critical uncertainties frame different landscapes of the future. The one tricky part about it is that because of that, it is very dependent on choosing the right critical uncertainties for the question you're asking. Having said all that, here's me walking through the method, and I'll do it again when we get down to your actual work groups. So the first question, what decision keeps you awake at night? What are you worried about? So let's say you're a snack food maker and you're worried about whether or not people are still going to want the new delicious product you have because it's fried, and people are heading off to a healthier, thinking about healthier lifestyles. So you're thinking, well, what is going to be, what's going to be the context in which I launch this new product? Is there going to be a huge value shift to healthier foods, or it's people have been so stressed out the last 3 years. Are they still in that phase of being self-indulgent? So you're dealing with an uncertainty about the market that isn't easily resolved. So, but your focus is, I'm thinking of making, a new fried food snack. Okay. Or you're a policymaker and you're worried about water supply and water stress. And you are thinking that you're going to have to implement some kind of really highly constraining water rationing, maybe? What are the different environments that decision might face? So question one, what is the focus issue? What's keeping you awake at night? Two, what are the critical factors that will make that decision a success or a failure? This is looking at your local operating environment. It's usually the aspects that you have control over. So for example, for a business person, the key factors with regard to the new snack food that you're thinking of are all the things having to do with your business that you control. Do I have staff to make it? Do I have the raw materials to make it? Do I have distributors to distribute it once I make it? Have I done survey market research to know that there's at least some potential customers out there for this? All of the things that are necessary to make that decision a success. That's what the key factors are, right? Things usually that you have control over and that are part of your business or part of your industry. So the industry in which your business is set, or if you're a policymaker, that are part of your department or part of the setting for that particular policy. Okay, so you're thinking now, listening to me, where do the uncertainties come in? Where do the big external changes come in? That is step three. What is going on in the macro environment? Because what you're trying to figure, you already kind of know what you'd have to do to make a success of your decision if it was just up to you and your company or you and your department, right? The problem is you have to launch this new product or you have to implement this new policy in a wider world, in a larger environment that has a lot of turbulence and volatility and uncertainty. And you need to think through how best to make your product or policy a success in an uncertain environment, which means it might face a lot of different conditions. So you have to figure out how to manage those different conditions. And you do that by saying, well, what are some of the driving forces? What are some of the big trends, emerging changes? And I know that your previous unit, the previous session, used driving forces in a slightly different way. In the context of this scenario building approach, it's mostly about just the changes that could make a difference, right? So what are the driving forces creating change in the wider world? Now, these are not necessarily connected to your decision. These are just the wider change forces in the world. Could be anything from climate change to changing demographics, the value shift, anything, right? So you take some time to identify them, or in the context of this workshop, you'll be brainstorming them. All right, so you have at this point, you have a question you're asking, you have details that you have some control over that will contribute to making that question, that policy, that product, whatever it is, a success. And then you have information about the wider context of the world and how it's changing. So fourth step, this is the single most important step in this. You look at those macro environment changes, the driving forces, and you rank them by importance, first of all, and that is, importance is how important they are with regard to their effect on those critical factors. Do any of these big driving forces of change affect any of those things that are critical to the success or failure? Which of your big forces of change will have the biggest impact on the things you need for the success or failure of your decision? So first you rank by importance, and then you take the ones that are the most important and say, which of these are the most uncertain? Now, here's the thing about uncertainty. Uncertainty doesn't mean you have a 20% chance of it happening and an 80% chance of it not happening. That's actually fairly certain. It's fairly certain it won't happen. Uncertainty means it's a 50-50 thing. And with a lot of changes, it isn't so much is it happening or it's not happening. It's, I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't know how it will play out. So big uncertainties. Two most important and most uncertain change drivers, just two. You can do this with three, it gets really cognitively complex, so I advise against it. Two most important, that means they're most likely to have an impact on your critical factors, and most uncertain. And restate them each as a pair of opposite outcomes. Okay, what does that mean? So here's the example, taken from the project we did with the ILO on thinking through labor relations in kind of COVID, post-COVID. Well, so one of the big uncertainties is we don't know what globalization is going to look like post-COVID. How isolationist people are going to be, how much they're going to go back to sort of the global world. So in terms of business, is that going to be back to normal with short supply chains and we all rely on each other and kind of trust each other to deliver things in time? Or are we going to start reshoring critical supplies of things? Two opposite ends, two opposite outcomes of that question about globalization. What about the speed of climate change? Is it going to speed up? Is it going to slow down? Will humanity have time to adapt? Or will the speed of climate change accelerate as we reach tipping points? We'll have no time to adapt and we'll go from crisis to crisis. Okay, opposite outcomes. Shift in global supply chains. Will that happen? How will that happen? So will there be business as usual and further expansion in China? Or will we shift production to Africa and other parts of Asia because we're getting more mistrustful of China? Then, because there was a rising trend in authoritarianism, and a lot of places it was very much seen as, you know, on the edge politically in a lot of upcoming elections, will authoritarian governments prevail? Will democracy and the rule of law be respected on the one end, or on the other end, there's more nationalism, rewriting of laws to the detriment of human rights? You'll note I put a red star there. I'll get to that in a second. Okay, you're going to select the two most important and most uncertain change drivers, restate them as a pair of opposite outcomes. So we've done that. Flesh out the scenario by referring to those key factors and suggest plausible events that might create each end state. And then start using the scenarios. How does the decision look in each scenario? Do a strength, weakness, opportunity, threats analysis. And finally, how do you give yourself advance warning that you might be heading to one or the other of these scenarios? What are the leading indicators or signposts that you are heading towards one? So if you look at this, will authoritarian governments prevail? The other choice here was the depth of the economic collapse. This was the actual results of the exploration we did. So will authoritarian governments prevail? The ends of the axes were democratic societies are stronger and inequalities are reduced. Authoritarian nationalist regimes prevail and inequalities increase. You'll note that the ends of the axes are stated as very strong opposites, right? Depth of economic collapse, full depression, long-lasting effect versus quick pickup, the economy quickly bouncing back. What this does, creating this matrix, is it essentially creates 4 different windows into the future. So window number 1, democratic societies are stronger and inequalities are reduced. Window number 1 is basically the world where democratic societies are stronger and inequalities are reduced. And we've had a quick pickup with the economy bouncing back very fast. And we said, generally, what is this future like? And then, because this was for the ILO, what are conditions like in this future specifically for workers, employers, and government? And people sort of brainstormed in this future, logically consistent with democratic societies are stronger and inequality is reduced, and a quick pickup economy. This is what some of the details would look like for the future. And it's simply a matter of imagining, brainstorming based on what you know credibly about how the world works. What would be some long range changes because these two parameters are working? Then scenario 2 is quick pickup economy, quickly bouncing back, but we've got authoritarian regimes and inequalities are increasing, right? And then the third scenario is nationalist regimes prevail, inequalities increase, and it's a full depression. You can imagine, because historically we have seen situations like this, you can imagine what some of the changes would be and what some of the impacts would be 10 years out, 20 years out, with a future that is defined by these two axes ends. And finally, full depression, long-lasting effect, but democratic societies are stronger and inequalities are reduced. Now, I don't want to go into more detail about this. I'll talk a little bit more about these case studies later. What I'd like everyone to do for just a second, humor me, before we go on to actually building scenarios, is look up, look away from your monitor or away from your laptop or away from your tablet, look at least 20 feet away or longer, stare out a window if you've got a tree outside your window, or look across the room if you've got a fairly large room. And why am I asking you to do this? Because it helps us to refocus and it helps us to relax and to reset our eyes from the eye strain of spending an hour and a half looking at the monitor. So just do me this favor, do yourself this favor, look up, look away, look out the window. Sadly, out my window is a lot of kind of gray, rainy, but you know, yours might be sunny and have trees, who knows? Do that. And the other thing I want to do is let everyone stand up, get a cup of coffee, get a glass of water, just take 2 minutes, come back at 20 after, but take 2 minutes and walk around a little, refresh yourself, because we're going to start doing some, you know, heavy critical and imaginative thinking in about a few minutes. So the first thing that I need is we need to have a focus issue. And what is something that we want to consider the future of? So it can be anything. The future of, I've frequently done the future of toilets. The future of sanitation and plumbing can be quite interesting. The future of food, the future of health, the future of labor, the future of gender equality. All right. So let's go with that. First person to call it wins. So what we are going to do is work on the future of gender equality. Now, I talked about critical factors. In order for gender equality, we're assuming that we want gender equality to happen. In order for gender equality to, in order for us to succeed in instituting gender equality in globally, I guess, what are some things that we would need to see in the world? What would need to happen? What would contribute to the success or failure of gender equality? So people can either call out, and I'll type, or if you are feeling fast and speedy on Miro, grab a Post-it. Immediate things that would make gender equality happen, or some of the roadblocks that might prevent it from happening. Chantal, what are some things that you think need to need to be in place to make gender equality happen? So women own assets.
So basically, women need to own the asset in the growth sector related to the SDGs, for instance. So sustainable agriculture, renewable energy. Sorry, I have no voice.
And okay, SDG growth sector. I can't write that fast. In SDG growth sectors. What else needs to happen? Better access to finance. Okay. What are some other things that are critical for social change? What kind of social change specifically? So a factor, I'm putting patriarchy and power as something that could be a failure factor. What else? Higher participation rate of girls in education, right? Legislation, so legislating rights. Political consensus to treat it as a priority. So just to sort of tidy up here. All right, so we've got a set of pretty good critical factors. Now here's the thing. What I'd like you to do is acknowledge that those are going to be critical for gender equality. Gender inclusive policies built in. I'm going to phrase that as, okay, not afterthought. Okay, so because we're doing this rather quickly, that's a good first start. Now, here's the tricky part. Does someone get equal pay down? Yeah, I think so. Okay. Now I want you to sort of sit back and just think about how the world is changing. What are some of the changes you see around you in the world that might have an impact on some of this? Broader changes. They don't have to be specific to gender equality, but so for example, economic uncertainty, global economic uncertainty. Because hard to get equal pay if we're in a depression. What are some other big changes that might affect some of this? Big global changes, things you can see happening in the world.
Digitalization.
Digitalization, right? Having a big impact on work and the whole context. What are some other changes that would have an impact on the wider context? Okay, reglobalization. Climate adaptation efforts. Demographic changes. Increased migration. What else? Market concentration. So we've got, let's see, we've got some economic, global economic uncertainty, reglobalization is both economic and IR, climate adaptation efforts, demographics, increased migration, the greater divide, increased digitization, gender fluidity. Are we counting more use of AI, maybe related to digitization or not? Greater diversity of family units, increased risk of catastrophes. Increasing conflict. Okay, so here's the thing. If you had to vote for the three most important ones of these with regard to, so back up a little, look at these changes. Which do you think, well, not even three, which do you think are the one or two that would have the most impact on whether or not women end up owning assets, or people change their mindsets, or there are different perceptions of women's images, or gender inclusive policies are built in or not? So which of these do you think are most important with regard to the impacts they might have on our critical factors up above? And you can either write it into chat or you can just shout it out. So which of the drivers of change that we've just listed do you think would have the biggest impacts on these critical factors for success? Okay, one vote for climate change adaptation. What else? Global economic uncertainty. Aleem, I think you meant to share that with everyone. Global economic uncertainty. So adaptation of climate change that tends to affect greater socio. Okay, global economic uncertainty, Raymond, that is a good call. Greater socioeconomic divide. Generally speaking, you want your two axes to be from different sectors. So you wouldn't want two economic axes. Federico, my pleasure. Do check back onto the Miro board for two things. One, there's a feedback link that the UNESCO would really, really love for you to fill out. And secondly, there are resources on the board, and I will add more. And feel free to keep adding ideas. But other than that, bye. Okay, so let's say we're taking, so greater socioeconomic divide, we can kind of fold into global economic uncertainty. So there's probably an economic axis here, because that will have a big impact on finance, owning assets, that sort of thing. And maybe we want to take climate change, adaptation to climate change. Or impacts of climate change generally. All right, so here's the thing. We need to, if we take global economic uncertainty, remember what I said, how would we restate that as opposite outcomes? Remember so what will be the level of global economic, what will the global economy be like? We're uncertain about it now, so what would be the two opposite outcomes that we could probably end up with? Right? We're putting, this is the horizontal. What will be the two ends of the axis? Remember, they need to be opposite outcomes. So on the one hand, right, we have equal and inclusive economic growth. And equal and inclusive economic growth is one possibility, even if I misspelled it. And what's the opposite of that?
Maybe winners takes all concentrated markets.
Oh, well put. Winners, whoops, whiners. Nope, winners take all concentrated markets. Okay, so we've got one axis, and then the other thing we were talking about was climate adaptation. efforts. Now, climate adaptation or we'll put this back for a second. Climate adaptation efforts will be our horizontal. So by that you mean we adapt really well or we don't adapt? What are the opposite outcomes that the person who suggested that was thinking?
Again, that was me, sorry. Don't want to dominate here. I was thinking we either invest in adaptation and which will reduce inequality, or we don't. And then we get more people that impoverish and migrate because they can't adapt to climate change and they're no longer able to feed themselves.
Okay, so all right, I'm going to borrow Alim's phrasing of this. So we either create some sort of just transition and manage impacts, or let's see. Well, actually, it's more about managing impacts because the whole justice. Oh, okay. This as I hope I'm demonstrating to you live. This is in fact the tricky part, is how you word these. So the other is
Collapse of biodiversity.
Everyone. Well, no, everyone suffers catastrophic impact,
right.
Basically. Yeah, so that's a better way to think of it, is impacts managed. Impacts managed. Sustainability achieved somehow. I'd be so happy if that were the case. Okay, so, oh, I didn't need to do that, sorry. So those are our two axes. These were our two core uncertainties. We converted them to these two axes. What we therefore have is a scenario. So now I want you to think again about, this is the world, scenario number 1, impacts are managed, sustainability is achieved, and it's equal and inclusive economic growth. Wow, that would be a great outcome. Okay, so what does the world look like? Feel free at this point to just grab a blue sticky and sort of say, well, one characteristic of this world is that fewer people live in poverty. Impacts are managed. Climate adaptation is a growth industry, right? Because we're managing all those impacts. So what else would be true of this world? Just generally. Less polluted. So the general idea, as those of you that want to, add more details, feel free to do that with Post-its. The general idea is first to sort of sketch out the general characteristics of each scenario to get a sense of what this world is like. Probably potentially fewer conflicts, because if we're managing impacts, we've had to come together in some ways, right? So you want to put in some general, green technology is certainly would be part of that. And then to go back to your topic and say, well, in this world, how good is this for gender equality, right? What are women doing in this world? What can they do in this world? I am Chantal. I am down in 2x2 scenario building, working on group 1. So again, another way to get there is to open the sidebar, go down to scenario building, group 1, 2x2 scenarios. That's where I am. What would this look like for women? What would they be doing? And feel free to unmute because I can type pretty fast. So if you just want to call out what you think some impacts are, I'd be happy with that.
Well, on a basic level, you'd have greater participation in the labor force. You'd also have women in non-traditional industries, also much more equal representation in governance and management. Of course, I guess that's also women and men in non-traditional industries.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Just to go quick, so that's essentially what we do, although we would spend more time doing it, and add in a lot of changes based on some of our the data we have on emerging changes that would fit into that scenario. Down here in this corner, we have the scenario that is defined by equal and inclusive economic growth. So yay, that's great, but impacts are still catastrophic. So we haven't adapted very well. We haven't achieved sustainability, but we have focused on social justice. So this is kind of a world where charitable aid to climate victims is a big thing. Right? We're focused on helping each other. The businesses probably constantly rebuilding because they're constantly being knocked back. More government aid to communities for rebuilding, things like that. How do women do in this scenario? Equal and inclusive economic growth, but a lot of catastrophic impacts. So the economy is weirdly doing well despite catastrophic impacts.
Yeah, this is almost the business as usual scenario.
Yeah, it
For
is.
better or worse.
And it's interesting, just to comment on that, there is almost always in building scenarios this way and using the 2x2s, there is almost one that's kind of like, this is where we are, only more so. So here we have winners take all, concentrated markets, everyone suffers catastrophic impacts. Actually, this is more business as usual, quite frankly.
Yes, it is.
Because we don't have
that's more aspirational on the inclusive and equal economic growth.
Good point,
Yes.
Ariana. Women in civil society leadership, exactly. Winners take all, concentrated markets, everyone suffers catastrophic impact, more conflicts, probably more labor exploitation, including women. Women in civil society leadership. Yeah, I think women would, especially the helping each other part, and charitable aid to climate victims. More women get involved, more labor exploitation, more conflicts. This is definitely, wow, this corner scenario is business as usual, which should be a cautionary tale. Winners take all, concentrated markets, but impacts are managed and sustainability achieved. Wow. So winners take all, concentrated markets. Impacts managed, sustainability achieved, and winners take all. So this is sort of survivor's rule. Whoever came out on top.
Rise of the green oligarchs.
Oh, I like that. Rise of green oligarch. So Amira, Chantal, Raymond, Sarah, do you get the sense of how this particular approach structures uncertainty and creates and helps you create for alternative futures?
I think I get the gist of it. I just thought of another scenario where, because in the first quadrant, where, for instance, the poorer countries would suffer because of like environmental trade, non-trade tariffs. You know, if you don't have a certain environmental standard, we don't import your goods.
That's interesting because so that would be,
because it's not equal and inclusive growth, but we have a certain level of managed sustainability. So like in the rise of the green oligarchs, you'll get then you know, the ones that cannot meet the environmental standards, they will suffer basically.
Yeah, that's the green
so
protectionism.
that is not
Right.
okay.
Okay.
Right, so that fits into this scenario. So this scenario is sort of a global scenario, and within it, different countries, different groups will experience different conditions. So what you're saying is, if impacts are managed and sustainability is achieved, roughly speaking, but there's concentrated markets, then the countries that can't meet the impact management standards, standards will be the losers.
Yes.
So that's a perfect example of how just looking at these two endpoints and kind of the logic of the world they define, you can imagine how that world will play out differently for different people or for different groups. And that's essentially what you're doing with these scenarios, is trying to imagine how different aspects of each future would look, and how different groups would experience these 4 different futures. So what I'm going to do just briefly, again, this worksheet gives you some additional questions for each scenario. So in scenario number 1, what challenges were overcome, what successes were achieved, what new challenges have arisen. So you could ask those questions as prompts to add even more details to each of these 4 scenarios. But the key part here in building scenarios this way, again, is that choosing the drivers of change based on how important they are in potentially affecting the critical factors for success or failure, and how uncertain they are, and taking the 2 most important and most uncertain, and using them to create this axis of, or these axes of opposite possible outcomes, and using the quadrant that you then get to define your scenarios and to start adding in different impacts, different conditions that would really differentiate the scenarios from each other. So I want to take you up a second. I won't go into great detail on this. You can look at some of the impacts that were generated by the ILO participants in these 4 scenarios. So I just refer you to the Miro board, and the Miro board will remain open. The Miro board is a resource for you to use. And in fact, one of the things that we can do is save it as a PDF. So each of these squares, each of these frames is a separate page on the PDF. I want to talk briefly about the other case study, which was for the European Commission's Director General of Research and Innovation. They were curious about what future scenarios of the world might be that would help them decide who would be good regions or countries for the EU to partner with in research and innovation initiatives. And after engaging in horizon scanning and looking for critical changes that driving changes that might have an impact on what we thought were critical success factors for research and innovation, we came up with these 4 scenarios. So the 2 uncertainties were So how global will the world continue to be, and to what extent are people will the values of the world be of embracing change versus resisting it and trying to hold a situation, especially the economic situation, constant. So the endpoints we got were a global inclusionary world that is really focused on progressivism, citizen involvement, globalism, power blocks, and demanding change, new economic models. Consumerism is critiqued. The emphasis is on rapid achievement of Paris Accords and post-scarcity economy. So what you get there are multiple strong, flexible government units that are connected, right? And we were using the metaphor of different kinds of trees. Bamboo, very strong, very flexible, very adaptive, and it's interconnected with roots. Versus demanding change, but being very localist and exclusionary. So we're going to create change. We're going to be, our country or our region is going to be very focused on achieving the Paris Accords, being really innovative with that regard, but we're doing it for ourselves. We're not doing it for the world. We're not doing it we're doing it for ourselves. We're being exclusionary. We're kind of nationalist. We're protectionist, right? So that's the willow. Bends, but it's solitary, single, strong, and flexible unit. Versus localist, exclusionary, protectionist, nationalist, and resisting change, really focused on consumerism, continued emphasis on rapid economic growth within the current model. Rigid, strong, solitary, the oak. Let me tell you, we wrote these and went, wow, we are kind of already in oak and we are intensifying oak. Then redwood, strong, not very flexible, but is interconnected. I didn't know that about redwood trees. So it's globalist, inclusionary, but kind of resisting change. It likes the world the way it is. It likes the world of, you know, multinationals and known power structures and everything else, and doesn't really want to change. What does that look like in the real world? So how we focused on these, there were certain things that we wanted to explore for our critical question: the attitudes and actions regarding climate change, the climate crisis, inequality in human rights, the emphasis on security versus economy, openness and access to information, that's important for research, intellectual property rights, are they protected or opportunists, and potential for misuse of resources that would support research and innovation. And I'm not going to go into details because you can see it, but each of these, we thought through what each of these particular characteristics would look like in each scenario. So this is our most progressive scenario: ambitious carbon reduction plans, internationalist approach, affirmative action at home with regard to human rights, networking and support. Sorry. By the way, I have loaded this as a PDF so you can page through it, right? Down in Willow, same thing. We work through it and say, well, there are ambitious targets at home, but trade restrictions, right? So for each of the scenarios, we very carefully worked through how they would be different on these core areas that we were interested in. Now, the other thing I will say is that these were the 4 overarching global scenarios. So there are 4 global scenarios that were written up, narratives. We then were tasked by the EC to create sub-scenarios for 10 regions of the world, not the EU. And so we basically said, what does, for example, East Asia look like in these 4 scenarios? What does Latin America look like in these 4 scenarios? So total for this project, there are 44 different scenarios that were generated using this approach. I'm going to stop there because I want to say there are resources here in the resource cloud. Some of them are papers. This particular paper I wrote with a colleague, Andrew Curry, and it contrasts the 2x2 scenario building approach with 3 others, so you might find it interesting. This particular paper, Rafael Ramirez and Angela Wilkinson have done a lot of work on polishing and refining the 2x2 scenario method. So they are also good resources. A few examples here of people, my grad students and other folks, working through that stage of, if these are the critical factors and these are some big drivers of change, how do we create axes, right? To give you some more examples. And now I'm going to end here by saying there is a link to a feedback form. And if you click on it, it'll say, oh, you want to go here to HPS forms, office, com, pages, etc. And if you click on it, you have a feedback page for this. And if you just want to give some thoughts, this is, what did I like from what we just did? What could we have done even more of? What should there have been less of? So a more informal way to do this. And I'm going to stop there. We have 3 minutes. I'm happy to stay on a few more minutes if people have questions, but I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you for participating. And for those of you who are still here, for being here until the very end.
Thank you very, very much, Wendy. I think we all enjoyed it, and I'm sure that we will need a follow-up session. There are so many things that we need to cover, but I have the feeling that we learned a lot. Aline, any thoughts from you?
Just a word of thanks to everyone. It's a very challenging topic when you're first approaching it, and that's been very clear and concise. And as you say, there's lots of resources to follow and more to be done. So thank you very much.
It was my pleasure, and I'll also add my my email contact to the board. So feel free to. I don't know about you. I always have questions like 2 hours later, so feel free to ask.
Thank you very much. My colleague was, advising this is something you'll be. I was amazed at the beginning. I didn't have an idea, but I liked it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Great. On this note, we would like to let you know that we will be informing you about the second set of Futures Masterclasses that will take place in January and February. We will be covering participatory futures, speculative futures, futures literacy lab, and foresight for systems change. We are hoping that to see you in the next sessions. A big thank to Wendy and Aline for putting together this masterclass and scenarios, and wish you a nice evening. Wish you to have a good day for the colleagues that are in different time zones. Thank you so much.